I'm trying to help people see something that our way of thinking now has excluded from the mental realm and therefore from the fulfillment of a life. The thing is that you don't know what it is you're missing if you only see things in a certain way. You have to be able to do a sort of trick whereby you see for a moment beyond the confines of what has been said to be the real and the true. And anyone who has heard about the hemispheres may well be of the opinion that all this is pop science and was all exploded a long time ago. Yes, a lot of what people used to say about hemispheres was wrong, but I've spent the last 30 years looking at what might be more true, and it's not so much about them doing certain things, like one does reason language, the other does emotions and so on, but they approach the world in a different way. They do everything, each of them, but they do it with a very different attention and a very different intention, and they therefore find a different kind of a world.
I guess if you could provide a thumbnail sketch of the forces that have led to this space where the left hemisphere is kind of pulling everything apart, seeing everything in just its purely material constituent parts, which obviously is so prevalent in the sciences and in some of the sort of popular thinkers of our day, the new atheists and so on, who want to kind of boil everything down to a kind of purely material explanations of things. Why has our culture pushed in that direction? Welcome to another edition of Re-Enchanting with me, Justin Brierley and Belle Tindall. This is the show that aims to help us re-enchant the world with the Christian vision of reality, with a whole variety of speakers, guests and thinkers. If you want more from the show, do of course check us out online at seenandunseen.com. It's wonderful to have Iain McGilchrist joining us today, isn't it, Belle?
It's an absolute delight. I'm so excited about this conversation. I have many notes. Many things to ask you. But first of all, I'll introduce you to our readers. So for anyone who has yet to encounter the great Iain McGilchrist, Iain is a psychiatrist and philosopher, the author of incredibly influential books, The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things, and his thesis on the left and right hemispheres of the brain have been, as I say, incredibly influential. Iain believes that the left hemispheric thinking has come to dominate much of our modern culture, perhaps in negative ways. We'll maybe get into some of that. So we're going to be discussing how we can enchant our view of the world by understanding these hemispheres and by re-engaging the right a little.
That's right. Really looking forward to our conversation today, Iain. But because we do normally record at the top of Lambeth Palace Library in London, we'll ask you our signature opening question. Very suitable, given all the books behind you. What are you currently reading, Iain?
Well, I'm not reading as much as I'd like because of the busy schedule I'm keeping up. But the one book that I am consistently reading and very much enjoying is Andrea Wolf's Magnificent Rebels, which has been recommended to me by a number of friends whose opinion I esteem. And it's a brilliant book. It's about the Jena Circle, the group of thinkers in the turn of the 18th, 19th century, who are to be found in Jena and Weimar and so on. And importantly among them are Goethe and Schelling, two very influential thinkers from my point of view. But also others like Hegel and the Schlegels, and it soon begins to sound like a Monty Python song. But they are fascinating people, and they are under the umbrella of the Romantics. Indeed, I think the subtitle of the book refers to this. This is a bit of a stumbling block, really, because the word romantic has been, if you like, taken in the way the left hemisphere would like to take it, as meaning a little bit wishy-washy, not really very good thinking, and carried away by emotion. But in fact, these thinkers are among the most serious and insightful and complex minds of the last few hundred years. It's a shame that the name romantic attaches to it because of that slightly negative idea that it carries with it. But they are, I still believe, the most insightful thinkers of modern times.
It's wonderful to hear some of your reading list, Iain, in that way. What I was aware of when I started to encounter your work was that your own books seem to manage to somehow traverse the usual divides. I've seen them being, endorsed by atheists like Philip Pullman and A.C. Grayling, and also the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. Before we sort of enter the meat of the subject, as it were, what is it about your approach and your writing that seems to have caught the attention of so many people across those divides, if you like?
Well, I'd like to say, because I think I'm onto something.
I think you can say that,
Certainly the feedback that I get from people in all walks of life, not just psychiatrists, neurologists, psychologists, but philosophers, lawyers, actually a lot of lawyers, which is interesting, politicians. Yesterday I was recording with Rory Stewart, and all walks of life. So one of my most devoted correspondents is a cleaner in Oxford, a slightly unusual cleaner, I suspect. I think he's got a doctorate, but also a long-distance lorry driver in Australia, and so the list goes on. And I think what they're responding to is that I'm trying to help people see something that our way of thinking now has excluded from the mental realm, and therefore from the fulfillment of a life. The thing is that you don't know what it is you're missing if you only see things in a certain way. You won't get. You have to be able to do a sort of trick whereby you see for a moment beyond the confines of what has been said to be the real and the true. And one distinction between the right and left hemispheres, I should say before I say anything more about hemispheres, that anyone who has heard about the hemispheres and hasn't acquainted themselves with my work may well be of the opinion that all this is pop science and was all exploded a long time ago. That's the first hurdle I have to get over, is that yes, a lot of what people used to say about hemispheres was wrong, but I've spent the last 30 years looking at what might be more true, and it's not so much about them doing certain things, like one does reason and language, the other does emotions and so on, but they approach the world in a different way. They do everything, each of them, but they do it with a very different attention and a very different intention, and they therefore find a different kind of a world. I can talk more about that if you want later, but to come back to one hemisphere difference that's very relevant for your question, the left hemisphere is, if you like, hermetic. It builds up a picture for itself that is self-consistent, and anything that is not consistent with that picture, it excludes from view. So it naturally comes to the conclusion that it sees everything and that everything coheres in this way. The right hemisphere, however, is much better at seeing the big picture. In fact, that is the single most important difference. The left hemisphere focuses in on a detail at a time, and probably about 3 degrees of the attentional arc of 360 degrees, and the other 357 degrees are what the right hemisphere is taking in with a broad, sustained, open vigilance. And one of the things it sees is that nothing is certain. I mean, there are obviously very high degrees of probability, but nothing is just completely cut and dried and black and white. And that things ramify and are complexly interconnected, and that context makes a difference, and that sometimes a thing and its opposite are both true, and all sorts of things that are very important. The value of the implicit, which underlies our love for the arts, for poetry, music, for visual arts, but also for myth, for narrative, for religion, for ritual, for all the things that can't easily be translated into the language of every day. And so it's aware all the time that it may be seeing only part of a picture and that picture can change and develop. Whereas the left hemisphere always sees, if you like, the same consistent picture, which is why it's very difficult to shift people who've spent their lives, as it were, building up walls around themselves. They've got a self-consistent world, and they don't want to hear about something that, as we now say, problematizes that vision.
So I have so many questions about that, particularly what you've touched on about how we are formed to see certain things and to not see certain things. And seeing as this podcast is brought to you by a website called Seen and Unseen, that is obviously very interesting to me. But I think before I get on to any of that, can I just ask, because I just thought about this even as you were speaking, what the relationship is between those hemispheres? And I don't even know if that's a right question to be asking, but I'm just wondering, are they warring against each other? Are they aware that each other exists? Do they work in tandem? How do they relate to each other, the right and the left?
Well, they're both present and involved in everything that we do under normal circumstances, and we're not aware of the specific contributions of one or the other normally. Okay. Although I have become more aware of the contributions because it's something I think about all the time. But there is a sort of asymmetry in their relationship, which I deal with mainly in The Master and His Emissary. And the asymmetry goes like this, that the right hemisphere literally sees more than the left hemisphere, understands more, and is actually more intelligent. Not just, and it certainly is more intelligent in terms of social and emotional understanding, but also cognitive intelligence. So it surprises some people that actually the right hemisphere is more important for all that. It attends better and attends more widely. It perceives better. It makes more sound judgments. So it is the master. That's the master of the title of the book. So they're not equal, should not be equally important. The right hemisphere should be the overseer. The left hemisphere does specific tasks, which it's very happy to do, very practice at doing, which it can do very quickly, which tend to be computational tasks, and to carry out certain serial instructions. But that needs to be reintegrated into the picture that the right hemisphere has, which is much broader and bigger. However, there is a different asymmetry which operates in the opposite direction, which is that the left hemisphere, knowing less, thinks it knows everything. And that is a good principle in psychology. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, that the less you know, the more you think you know it all.
Right.
And conversely, the more you know, the more you're aware of what it is you don't know. Absolutely. So, as I was saying, this is the difference between the right hemisphere, which is aware of the limitations of its knowledge, but the left hemisphere doesn't seem to be aware. The left hemisphere and right hemisphere communicate with one another all the time, but much of the traffic is inhibitory. So one hemisphere is saying, for the moment, don't interfere because I'm dealing with this. So they're doing two different things. They're producing two kinds of world, and effectively we need them both. But at any one moment, it may be that one of them needs to exclude the vision of the other, and the one that does more excluding is the left hemisphere. So the right hemisphere communicates with the left more and more swiftly than the left does with the right. And when there is damage in infancy to the brain, and there is room, as it were, only for certain things to develop, what happens is something called crowding, in which the standard left hemisphere tasks crowd out those of the right hemisphere. So the right hemisphere is like a wise ruler who knows a very great deal, but is in a way being sidelined by a jumped up functionary who knows how to do certain things, but because it doesn't really understand the rest, thinks it's got it all.
And is our culture, our society at the moment, is it aiding that, the left, the jumped up guy? Would you say that we are forming and are being formed in a way that is trying to reverse the balance, the natural balance as you've just described it.
Yes, we are. And how that has come about and so on is something we can go into. But it would be another topic, really. But I mean, I'm happy to go there if that's where you'd like us to go.
I guess I was going to say it's a huge area and we're not going to be able to cover all of it. But I suppose I'd be interested to hear a general picture of how that's manifested in our culture. You frequently talk about left hemispheric versus right hemispheric ways of seeing the world, essentially. And you've spoken at length and written at length about the way that a left hemispheric view of looking at reality has come to dominate in academic circles, science, and so on. I guess if you could provide a thumbnail sketch of the sort of the forces that have led to this place where the left hemisphere is kind of, if you like, pulling everything apart, seeing everything in just its purely material constituent parts and so on, which obviously is so prevalent in the sciences and in some of the sort of, popular thinkers of our day, the new atheists and so on, who want to kind of boil everything down to a kind of purely material explanations of things. Why? I suppose it's a big question, but why has our culture pushed in that direction, given that there is meant to be this, as Belle says, this relationship, the proper relationship between the two hemispheres?
Well, in the second half of the Master and his Emissary, I look at the history of ideas in the West, starting with the ancient Greeks and moving forward to the present day. And I can see three overarching patterns of repeat. So in the 6th century BC in Athens, around the year dot in Rome, and around the 14th, 15th century in Italy particularly, but in Europe in general, with the Renaissance, there arose an amazing, almost like an eruption of a flourishing culture in which the left and right contributed in the best way that they can work together. And in every case, there was, over time, a drift more and more towards a simple view, that of the left hemisphere. So there are a number of reasons why I think that has happened. I think it's happened in our contemporary culture since about the time of the Enlightenment, which was a great movement, but it unfortunately was also a hubristic movement. In other words, it thought in an arrogant way that it could control and understand everything, and that all true ideas could be formulated in simple sentences, that they could be communicated to another person directly using that language, and that they would all cohere, they wouldn't contradict one another. But unfortunately, reality is more complex than that. I think what happens is that in the new introduction, the one I wrote in 2019 for the 10-year anniversary of the Master and his Emissary, I think I give about 6 or 7 reasons why this tends to happen. But one is that the left hemisphere is the one that enables us to grasp and get stuff. That is, in fact, how it evolved and why it evolved. It evolved in order to enable us rapidly and efficiently to pick something up, usually to eat it, and eventually to be able to use tools. But in other words, to manipulate the world and to apprehend it, to grasp onto it. Whereas the right hemisphere is holding the rest of the picture together so that we don't just apprehend the world, but comprehend, to hold it together. And that's a quite different task, if you like. But when a society gets very large, a number of things happen. First of all, it's harder for people to know one another, to know that they can trust one another and so forth. So things have to become done at a distance. They have to become more theoretical. The very fact that there is a growth of something like an empire means that governing it requires, again, a process that can be, as we would now say, rolled out. So beforehand, there have to be bureaucratic procedures that are approved, that will enable something to happen in the colonies and so forth. And so what you get is a very crude, simple control mechanism that takes over from the full complexity of life. And you see it in the art and the architecture and the poetry and the music, and you see it in the way in which people think. So, I mean, I've had to gloss over a huge amount there, and people will say, how does he see that? But my only answer to that is, well, I do go into it at some length in my writing. But I think it's because it aids the one in us which wants simple answers that will enable us to be powerful. It's power that is the main, what shall I say, the goal, the value that excites and motivates the left hemisphere. That is its purpose, its raison d'etre, is to give us power. It's the one that controls our right hand, with which we do the grasping and the grabbing. Whereas the right hemisphere is doing the far more difficult task of holding together a very complex and rich picture. If you like, the left hemisphere is like a map. It has a very simplified diagram, a theory about what's going on. I think the rise of theories about what's going on that are uncorrected by looking around you and saying, is that at all probable, is one of the things that we're experiencing right now. There are some really quite extraordinary theoretical assumptions being made that would have appeared and will appear if we have a future, again, completely absurd. But they arise out of a theoretical construction, not out of a real and true lived understanding of what it is to be human.
I think that's so helpful. And just to reiterate that to our listeners, that the books are gold, in that everything that Iain is saying there is the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is incredibly profound. But I think while just acquainting myself with your work, I've been surprised in certain ways. You know, I read about this left hemisphere, and we'll get onto some of it, because I think particularly in regard to the sacred, I've been surprised that the left hemisphere is having a say where I assumed I was operating primarily in the right. But before that, I think one of the most obvious ways that hit me like a ton of bricks, where I thought, oh, I can see myself. And I like to be honest with this, because I sometimes think I'm prototypical of many people in my generation, is the left hemisphere of my brain really has the first and final say when it comes to tribalism and polarization and division. I think particularly in regards when I think about cultural issues and social justice issues and political issues, I read in your work, what I've realized, and I feel very challenged by it, is I'm operating almost exclusively in the way you've just mentioned. And I was just wondering if you could touch upon that a little bit, how everything you've just said you see play out in this absolute default into what Elizabeth Oldfield calls our people like us-ness, our preference to be in echo chambers.
Yes, and the stigmatization of anybody who differs from you as
absolutely
can't be contacted, can't be respected, can't be hoped to form some sort of bridge over which we can, in a civil fashion, communicate. One of the difficulties here is that the left hemisphere always wants a quick answer that is cut and dried. So it tends to go for things that are very simple. Its worldview is almost ridiculously easy to communicate, and is therefore it's sort of money for old rope for the idea. There's nothing in the cosmos that has any meaning. There are no values. There's just a lot of matter bumping into other bits of matter, and somehow we're here for a while and we make what we can of it. And that's a very easy position to put forward. And if anybody puts anything else up, you just say, how do you justify that? And prove that to me, and so on. Whether or not actually that is the correct way of trying to understand what is being gestured towards. So the cut and dried nature, the black and white, the either or element is part of it. But also, one of the mistakes that, one of the almost limitless mistakes that people make when they think I'm talking about the bad old idea about right and left hemisphere, was that the left hemisphere was unemotional and was therefore probably reliable, even if a little bit dull. But it's not unemotional, and it is absolutely not reliable. It is literally delusional when divorced from the influence of the right hemisphere. And in the early part of The Matter with Things, I look at about 30 delusional syndromes, and in all but one case, the vast majority of these are caused by deficits in the right hemisphere, not in the left. And I'm not the only person, at least a couple of other people in the neuroscience field have quite independently said the left hemisphere is frankly delusional, and it is. So, but the other thing is it does have an emotional timbre, and the emotion that most strongly lateralizes is in fact anger, and it lateralizes to the left hemisphere. Others are disgust and self-righteousness. So if you are locked into this left hemisphere field, not only do you espouse a very simple position that cuts out anything that might complicate it, so you don't have to argue about it or say, well, yes, but it's more complicated than that. And you are simultaneously angry if you are challenged, you are completely self-righteous, and you're disgusted by people who disagree with you. Now, I don't know if you can relate that to the experience one sometimes has in modern life, particularly on the internet, then, but I imagine it rings bells. So what I see happening is the preference for clear-cut, simple answers to more nuanced positions. There are a couple of things that are very important here, and it can be stated quite briefly. One is the importance of context, which we've completely lost. So context can entirely reverse the meaning of something. And once it's taken out of context, which is what happens in modern discourse, because we're only interested in quick fixes and sound bites, not in long and deep discussions, is that things are misunderstood because the context is what makes them what they are. If you think of the world as the left hemisphere does, of made up of things, you start with the things and then you put them together, or we put them together in a certain way. You have that view that context is not important. It tends to, whatever it's looking at, it tends to say, oh, and it's an example of so-and-so. It takes it out of the context and, as it were, puts it into a category. Whereas the right hemisphere is seeing that actually everything is individual and unique, in fact, ultimately. That, of course, there are commonalities that enable us to make generalizations, but that everything is interconnected. And it's the interconnections in the web that make what we call a thing what it is. So I argue that relations are primary to the relata, the things that are related. In other words, I say the relations come first, and what we think are the things come secondly. And that may sound very odd to most people. How can you possibly have a relation if you haven't got the things yet? But if you think of a net or a web, what you're doing is you're looking at this web and you're focusing on a detail somewhere and you're saying this is a thing. But it isn't actually a thing. It's where various relationships meet. And it's just as true that you can't say what a thing is to start the process until you see what it's related to and how it comes to be what it is out of a context. So the context is primary. And the other thing that goes slightly with this is the hidden shadow side of everything that we think is good. And sometimes the hidden redemptive side of something that seems to us ill. And I think that is what we drastically miss. So that the way this plays out is, suppose in a certain context, we see that a little bit of something is required to rebalance. And we do that, and in fact, it has a good impact. We then think we must go on and on and on, pushing further and further in this direction and excluding everything else. What you don't notice is that the very improvement has changed the context. And now by having more of this, it may actually have harmful effects. A very simple example of this is freedom versus constraints or boundaries or authority or simple respect. These are concepts that are not common nowadays. But if you just valorize freedom at the expense of anything else, what you eventually end up is an anarchic chaos. And what emerges from an anarchic chaos is tyranny. So your pursuit of freedom goes so far that it leads to the very thing you were hoping to avoid. Now, I think that in some of the modern world, people who are quite well-intentioned think that by pushing and pushing certain things that they see as needing to be pushed, they cause divisions to arise where formerly there may not have been such a division. So divisiveness, tensions between abstractly conceived groups and categories become more damaging rather than less damaging. And even in things like the gap between the rich and the poor, when I was growing up, the gap was not as great as it is today, but we all thought it was going to get smaller. So lots of things are deteriorating because of this absolutist misunderstanding of the fact that nothing can be taken out of context, and everything has an opposite that is concealed for the time being, unless you get into the habit of seeing the thing and its opposites do a kind of dance together and exist together and need one another.
I am just breaking into today's conversation to remind you that Re-Enchanting is brought to you by Seen and Unseen. Seen and Unseen is a magazine website with hundreds of articles by hundreds of contributors, all written to give you a Christian perspective on just about everything. That's culture, trends, current affairs. There are articles on it all, and you can find all of it at seenandunseen.com. But for now, back to today's conversation.
Just picking up on some of the things you're saying there, I've heard a lot of people talking and yourself referencing various types of crises that seem to be affecting culture at the moment, Iain. And you could name, for instance, the meta crisis, a sort of sense that there's lots of different factors, technological, ecological, social, that are coming together to kind of create a sort of almost semi-apocalyptic vision of the future and what it may hold and so on. There's this meaning crisis that many psychologists are talking about, the fact that many people don't seem to have a story to make sense of their lives any longer. And then you've got the mental health crisis, the apparent sudden rise in problems among young people especially and so on. I'm sure they're all interlinked. Again, big question, but where the left hemispheric domination that you've been talking about, how does that play into these specific various crises that we're now sort of seem to be having to try to find solutions to, especially here in the West?
Well, as you rightly say, Justin, they're interconnected. And I suppose the umbrella term is the meta-crisis. And how I see that is that the various aspects, some of which you delineated, the environmental problems, the socio-economic problems, the problems of the way in which we think about ourselves, these are all aspects of a certain take on the world, which is that of the left hemisphere. And in a talk I gave at Darwin College, which has been widely viewed on the internet, in Cambridge, it's a series they run of Darwin lectures. I argued that our various problems stem from the espousal of a left hemisphere point of view, and that they could have been predicted, and indeed were predicted by many people. They wouldn't have been able to put their finger on exactly what it was, but I think I can make it clear that it is to do with that left hemisphere take. The meaning crisis is part of this, but is very interesting. When you have a sort of fundamentalist scientistic view that everything can be explained by science, various things happen. You rule out of existence, and certainly out of examination, all those things that can't actually be measured and reproduced and manipulated in the laboratory. And these turn out to be the things that most matter to us and give our lives meaning. And they include the creative arts, they include a sense of the sacred and of the divine, they include the ability to appreciate and understand nature, and they include things like empathy and compassion. Now, these things are very hard they can't be seen, they can't be measured on a scope of some kind. People sometimes say, oh, well, you can scan the brain and so on, but these people usually know very little about brain scanning, because nobody who's up on that would ever say what you're measuring is any of those abstract and rather wonderful things. You're measuring proxies in terms of chemicals or blood flow, which are extremely crude and are not necessarily measuring what you think they're measuring at all. There are enormous pitfalls in that view. So a world in which we have excluded from our view the things that make the world mean something for us is bound to lead to a situation in which there's a so-called crisis of meaning. And I sometimes refer to the three things that seem most important for human flourishing: mental flourishing, physical flourishing, and societal flourishing. And these are our relationships with one another in a community where we trust one another, we think we share values, we share our lives, we share our meals, we share our worship. The second is the relationship with nature, which used to be something that inevitably people were very close to. I mean, until a couple of hundred years ago, 99.9% of the world's population lived necessarily in very close proximity to nature. Now it might be less than half. And the third is the realm of the sacred or the divine. And to have lost this is a catastrophe, because we know, I mean, even for just venal and utilitarian calculus, having such a relationship with the divine seems to be the most potent indicator of psychological health, emotional health, mental health, and physical health. Unbelief. But all these things go together, of course. They're all aspects of one another. And so if you really wanted to make people feel completely at sea, and as though they had no rudder and no compass, you would take away those things that are the very lodestones of life. So that's, I think, where the meaning crisis comes from. And I think I've already touched on why this is a mental health crisis. People feel lonely on a scale that is never been seen before. And tragically, most young people feel that 85% of them feel that life is pointless and meaningless. So we really have a vast crisis here, a meta-crisis that involves a meaning crisis and leads to a mental health crisis.
There's so much in there to pick up and kind of dwell in. But I would love to tilt the conversation slightly, just because you've mentioned it a few times, towards the sacred, the divine. I suppose me, because I'm a Christian, I would call him God, but that's a part of that is why I left my left hemisphere wanting to do that. And I'm just wondering if you could, before we kind of dig into some of the specific questions about the sacred and things, you said in a conversation, I think with Nick Spencer, who we love on Re-Enchanting, he's a previous guest, there is something very deep and very important in the world which does not map onto a purely material counterfeit. Could you, the final chapter in The Matter with Things is about this idea of the sacred. Could you just give us an overview of what you mean by the term the sacred, and why we've literally trained ourselves, to not attend to it?
Yes, well, of course, there's a paradox in what you've asked me to do, which is to articulate something that the most important thing to realize about it is that it is beyond articulation.
Absolutely.
So, and this is true in all traditions. So, for example, the great work of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, begins, the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. And when we think we've got it, we know that we haven't. That is proof positive that we haven't. St. Augustine said, "Si comprehendis non est Deus." If you think you understand it, then it's not God you've understood. So, and of course, I can't do anything about the fact that inflexible atheists will say, "Oh, it's a typical cop-out." But I'm afraid that doesn't deter me, because I know from experience what I'm talking about. I've thought and read about it all my life, and indeed, if my life hadn't taken the path that it had, it was probably going to take the path of me going into a monastery. So, and all my life I've had this sense of something very profound that is much greater than anything I can reduce to common language, but is utterly real and cannot be denied. It's only denied by people who are fixated on the idea that if language can't encompass it, then it can't be real. If it can't be seen and measured, it isn't real. But this is just a basic error, because we know there are so many things in this world that are not explicit and measurable. And one of the things I found when I was studying literature was that poems are a way of language getting beyond language. So it's language used to subvert language, the limitations of language. And that in a poem, something rather marvelous happens, that the language enables you for a while to get beyond the limits of what it is you're normally thinking. It takes you somewhere else for a while, and you feel something very powerful. But when you're asked to say, what does the poem say in everyday words, it suddenly collapses into a banality. But it isn't that banality. It is what has been lost in the reduction to that banality. And the same thing happens every time you take apart something which is a complex whole and try and account for it through the parts. I hope it doesn't any longer need to be stated that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And when I was at school, 15 or 16, my clever colleagues would say to me, so what's this other magical thing that gets added in? But it's not something that's added in, it's something that was taken away in the process of trying to analyze it. And, a piece of music can be analyzed as far as you like until you come down to a bunch of single notes. That won't help you understand the whole piece that you've just destroyed. Through our experience, we contact a realm that speaks to me, and speaks possibly to many, many other people. I suggest that the evidence is that it does around the world. And that is what we call the sacred or the divine. And it is almost defined by the fact that it can't be uttered, it can only be pointed to, which is a concept that the Eastern traditions very much understand.
Yeah.
That language it betrays you when you try to articulate it. What happens with the insights that mystics have is that these, I think, are enormously revelatory and very powerful. As far as I'm concerned, the mystical tradition is the most powerful and important tradition. Is that then people with their left hemispheres come along and say, well, we need to codify this, and we need to make it something like a legal document, and then we want you to sign at the bottom, and it's the business of, believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. And I think that vision of what we're talking about is what keeps people away from something that is, once you come to see it, is everywhere and is our birthright. And it's so sad that the way we think now is divorcing people from the possibility of understanding that depth that gives so much meaning and joy to life.
If I could keep on the personal sort of side of things a little bit, I was fascinated to hear you say that you once considered, life as a monk yourself, because I suppose when it comes to the question of God, we do find ourselves in this difficult position of living in a very sort of left hemispheric culture where people do want to sort of have some kind of philosophical or scientific explanation for God. That's what people like Richard Dawkins always demand. And yet at the same time, obviously, it's not the kind of thing that can be expressed in that way, and so on. So what, as someone who sort of is obviously extremely sympathetic and has written, increasingly about the divine and the sacred and God specifically, Iain, how do you think we can present this to people in a very left hemispheric sort of culture in a way that hopefully steals past, as Lewis put it, the watchful dragons, that helps them to engage God and the sacred in ways that don't simply collapse again into, well, let me give you 3 propositions or whatever it might be?
Yes, it's a good and difficult question. I think the first thing is to realize what it is that has been lost from our world. And that's a difficult thing to be aware of. Your culture stops you seeing what it is that very culture stops you from seeing. And one answer to that is a humanistic education that introduces you to the great minds of the past, who can hardly be dismissed, people of astonishing intelligence and learning, who nonetheless were able to see things that we no longer see. And this also includes the Romantics, which I think is an easier path for many people than the expressly religious path, because the defences go up as soon as the God word is mentioned, which is why when I talk about the sense of the sacred in that chapter, I do move towards talk of God, but I say, but how many misconceptions are wrapped up in that name?
Yeah.
And it can be for many people a stumbling block, because they don't understand what it is that's being referred to and indicated. And I think that the Church can and must, of course, bear much responsibility for this, for projecting for a long time the picture of God as a sort of a superhuman engineer, or even worse, a kind of wrathful, almost psychopathic ruler who will not take any offence. And I think these are problems for people entering into an understanding of that world. And what I tried to do in The Matter with Things was to, by going through neuroscience and then through philosophical discussion of the various ways in which we can come to understand the world, and these very much include reason and science, things that have served me very well, but they do also include intuition and imagination, which can reveal things that reason and science can't. They can be mistaken, but so can reason and so can science. In fact, one way of describing science is the study of the perpetually mistaken, because, of course, science is always evolving. But our thinking should always be evolving, and we need these other faculties. So I've taken people by the hand in walking through the book and said, do you see why I would say this? Can you see what is meant here? And then I take them through looking at the coincidence of opposites, the relationship between the one and the many, through time, through flow, through space and matter and consciousness, and through values, and even a sense of purpose I dare to treat. And by the time people have read that, I'm hoping that it won't seem so bizarre to think about the possibility that there's something in this idea of the sacred. And what really has moved me is I get many, many, many letters, and I hope they will carry on coming, because I value them so much. But I really do feel humbled by the fact that somebody like me, who doesn't really know how to describe myself in religious terms, have brought people to an understanding. So people write to me saying, I was always a completely confirmed atheist, but after reading your book, I'm persuaded that I really need to take the idea of a divinity more seriously. And that's rather wonderful, because, I didn't anticipate it, but there it is. And it's, I was going to say, it's been in the background. I don't think I used the word God, or maybe once or twice in the Master and his Emissary, but a number of people have really seen that it is a kind of work of cryptotheology. It uses science and philosophy to take us to a position where the divine is more credible.
I think that's so fascinating. I think, like you were saying about the Romantics, and I've only just got into the Romantics, and I'm absolutely loving everything I'm finding. But this idea of, if we're using poetic language, it's not true. When actually, if we can only use poetic language, it's because it's so true. That's all we've got. Or if we're uncertain of something, it can't be true. But actually, if we're uncertain, it's probably because that's as close as we'll ever get to the truest thing. And all of that is fascinating. And what I'm thinking of as you're speaking is that not only does the left hemisphere stop or halt or distract us from believing in the divine, so meeting the sacred, meeting the divine for the first time, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say ignoring, ignoring and just having blinkers on. So what I did when I sort of started delving into your work was, I thought, right, well, I'm a Christian. I dabble in the spiritual aspects of me, and, I use intuition and imagination, and I have a faith. So obviously I'm quite well acquainted with the right side, the right hemisphere. Obviously that's, well done, Belle, you're doing okay. And I think the more I delved into your work, I thought, oh, hang on. Even in those realms, even in my relationship and my experience and my encounters with things that are sacred, with the spiritual realms, even the things that I would say happen in my soul, which is not adequate language, but that's okay. Even there, the left hemisphere is having a big old influence. So I think I was just wondering, even from a place of belief in God, how do I shut that left hemisphere up? Even when I think I am using the right, how can I just really push that left out of the picture, even if it's just momentarily?
Well, in what you said is implicit that the left hemisphere is very valuable, that it has a role to play, a very important role. The problem is only when it oversteps its limitation. And this is why I use the concept of hubris, because in Greek tragedy, it is always that the hero is valuable, valorated, but becomes arrogant, thinks that he can do more than he actually can. And that causes the catastrophe, literally the downfall. And I think civilizations do this, and I think people do it, that when they think they know it all, or know far more than they do, things start to go wrong. So we do need somehow to limit it. And I think the answer is, there isn't any one single answer to it. But I keep coming back to my work, which sounds very self-serving, I know. But what I'm really saying is that I think there's no one little soundbite I can give people that will help them. This is a trick you do. Every morning with breakfast you say this or you do that. Now, of course, there is nothing exactly like that. But what I've tried to do is to revitalize a vision of the cosmos that is still, I think, profoundly important, which is one that to a large extent we've lost. We can't know certain things, and the more we get to understand science, the more we realize the limitations of science. In about 1900, the physicist was saying, well, we've really got it all worked out. There's nothing left to discover. Maybe we should just wind up the physics faculty and go home. And then suddenly, within 10 years, a bombshell was exploded and everything was up in the air. And as a result, physicists are not frightened to say that they don't understand a lot of what they are dealing with. Biologists have found it much easier, paradoxically, dealing with the living world, to reduce it to a mechanism, and they've been aided in that by molecular genetics and the rise of it and the strengths that it has. But unfortunately, this has led people to believe that everything is mechanical. And we're now realizing very recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, biologists are beginning to wake up to the fact that everything is not mechanical and that very little indeed is. And that we are dealing with complex systems that are not reducible to a mechanism. Now, if you can see that in relation to science, that produces a certain degree of humility in relation to our ability to understand the whole complexity of the cosmos. It's a rather irrational belief that our brains now, at this point in evolution, know everything or can know everything. Why would that be the case? Evolution is a process. If a mouse could speak, I sometimes say, it would probably say, I understand everything, because it understands everything it understands.
Yeah.
But we only know the things, as it were, that we know. And the biggest mistake you can ever make is not to be aware of the unknown unknowns. In other words, it's those unknown unknowns that cause the problem. And what I have tried to do is to open up to people's awareness the fact that there are unknowns there that can't be just dismissed, but may hold the secret if we are able to embrace them and to not finally come to understand them. I don't think that's going to be possible, but at least to enter into a richer and deeper understanding that will transform our sense of what a human being is and what the world is and what we're doing here.
If I may, as we start to bring this towards a close, Iain, I've noticed, as I've said at the beginning, your work being embraced and talked about across lots of different spheres and lots of different people. You've spoken yourself about how it seemed to have broken down some of the hostility towards faith and religion and God in some atheists that have been engaging with it. But as you said yourself, you've struggled to say exactly what you are in terms of religiosity and so on. I don't think you call yourself a Christian necessarily, but I think so much of what you say sort of dovetails remarkably well with the Christian story. I suppose I'd like to ask, if it's not too impertinent, why you don't find yourself able to necessarily call yourself a Christian or embrace the Christian story in that sense.
Yes, well, it's hardly surprising that I seem to be Christian, because I have found, of all the religious traditions that I know anything, first of all, I know the Christian tradition best, but I've also found that it speaks to me more than any other tradition and seems to me deeper and more complex and richer than any other pathway to the divine and sacred that I know. So a lot of people would say, well, that makes you a Christian. And maybe I'm just trained to doubt myself and trained to doubt any statement of certainty. But it seems to me that the end of wisdom is to reach a point where you say, what do I know? This point was reached by Socrates, by the Buddha, by Confucius, by St. Paul, by many great people who'd spent Montaigne at the end of his life. What do I know? And I feel in that position that I belong closer to what do I know than I do to the Christian thing. But I think the problem is only that when I'm presented with either a view that Christianity is exclusively right and that other traditions don't have their wisdom and their value, and when I'm asked to, of course, depends what you mean by believe in a certain thing. I talk about the nature of belief in my writing, and I don't think it necessarily means a literalistic belief, though I think, as far as I'm concerned, when you're in the realm of talking about God, then who are we, as it were, to say what cannot literally happen? But it doesn't bother me to think of it in terms of a myth or metaphors, which doesn't mean to say it's untrue, because these are the ways in which we discover truth. So it is through narratives, through myths. There is nothing more powerful than the Christian myth. And I use the word myth in its classical sense of mythos, which has no element of suggestion of it being untrue, just that it is actually a kind of truth that is bigger than logos. And, you know, in the ancient Greece, mythos, from which we get the word myth, was considered greater than logos, from which we get logic. So the sort of truth in logos was a kind of everyday truth in which you argue in a court of law that somebody owes somebody a sum of money. But mythos was the way in which we image to ourselves through stories, through narratives and images and so on, something that simply escaped everyday language. And so, as far as I'm concerned, everything is metaphorical. I hate to tell the Dawkinses and Dennets of this world that they can't do philosophy or science without metaphors. Everything boils down to metaphors in the end. Metaphors is how we understand everything. So you cannot say there is a final truth there. What you're saying is this metaphor in which I'm bringing together this and that is the closest that I can get to revealing the truth. And I don't think that Christianity, in my experience, is going to ever offer me a comfortable bed of certainty. Faith would not be faith if it was simply a set of facts discovered by science. Faith is from a root meaning fidelity. In other words, of being faithful to something that you believe in the sense that you believe in the person that you have learnt most from or the person who is most valuable to you. And I certainly believe in God. I believe in Christ, if it is in those terms. If you ask me to sign the fine print about what a camera would have shown if it was outside the sepulchre, I really don't know. And I can't deny that there's a possibility that a body walked forth. I really can't. And I can't be absolutely certain of that either. So for these sort of reasons, I say I'm not sure I'm a Christian.
Well, I was going to say something similar. I think most people, even people who are happy to call themselves Christians, exist somewhere on that spectrum of faith and doubt, and uncertainty is part and parcel of it. I mean, when you leave the study and the books and the neuroscience behind, and perhaps just attend a church service, do you feel like you can engage in that sense at some different level?
Absolutely, I do. And I was very fortunate where I was brought up in the south of England to be able to go to a cathedral and also to a chapel every day if I wanted, where there was wonderful music and readings from Holy Writ and very beautiful prayers that, I can still recite by heart because they've gone into my psyche. And I still pray them. Unfortunately, I can't go to those services anymore. And I'm sure that the advice would be, well, go to any service, it's better than none. I'm not sure about that. But what I can answer is very clearly that when I do go to a holy service, it moves me profoundly. And I can tell you the most profoundly moving services I've been to. One was in Assisi, and another was in Soviet Russia when I went to St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. And I went to a mid-morning service at a Russian Orthodox cathedral. And I was completely transported by it. And I thought, what is being expressed here cannot be expressed better than it is here, as the beautiful and the holy and the true. And it was intensified for me by the fact that the people who were there had all made sacrifices to be there, because as they came and went from the cathedral, there were leather-jacketed thugs with sunglasses on photographing them all, so that they could make sure that their children wouldn't get to university and so forth. I mean, now things are somewhat different in that respect, but I have been deeply moved by occasions of worship in different contexts, mainly in monasteries actually, but in many churches and cathedrals. What I suppose people would say is, am I a cultural Christian? That's a rather a put down, I think. I think it goes a bit further than that. I hope it does. I hope that it, in some ways, is part of the fabric of my being. There you have the best answer I can give to whether I'm a Christian or not.
Oh, Iain, that's absolutely beautiful. It's never happened before that while I'm recording an episode of Re-Enchanting, I already can't wait for it to come out because I already want to listen to an episode of Re-Enchanting. But that seems to be happening. I already cannot wait to listen to this back. And I think both Justin and I, in a sort of our separate context, in our separate ways, are finding a similar thing, which is that we are exhausting ourselves only attending. And societal we in the West, the cultural we, not just Justin and I, are exhausting ourselves only attending to the left hemisphere. And everything that you've said about attending to the right hemisphere of our brain and that need for that and the sacred within that and it being within the fabric of who we are, I think we're all seeing a bit of a shift, a cultural shift in that. And so I suppose my final question to you before we let you go, which I can tell we're both reluctant to do, Justin and I, is, are you sensing that same shift? Are we getting too tired of only attending to what was supposed to be, although integral, the slightly lesser influential hemisphere of our brain?
I definitely think so. And interestingly, I think that it is less stigmatized now than it was perhaps 25 years ago to say that you are a believer in the divine, in the sacred. I think that is now accepted much more. And I think more people, particularly young people, are reaching for something that they know to be real and true, but they've been taught to disattend to. And they're very conflicted about that, I think. And when I go and speak in public, I find that a lot of such people come to speak to me afterwards, and whatever it is I'm saying seems to be reaching something in them. Because I think we all have this awareness inside us of something if we don't just disattend to it. And if we completely disattend to it, it will cease to be for us. The things that we just don't take into account and refuse to attend to, we just don't see. There's a famous film clip called Gorillas in Our Midst, which demonstrates that if you're not expecting to see something, you just won't see it, however blatant and extraordinary it is, right in front of your eyes. So, and I think that's the position that we're in. And all we need to do is to allow a little room, for this in our life and see what happens. And if nothing happens and it doesn't seem to, you don't resonate with it, then it's time to say, okay, I gave it a proper try. But I think you should give it a proper try. There's nothing lost by behaving as though you believe. And I suspect that anyone who does that will find that something is given to them, that something happens to them. And I can't specify exactly what that is, but it may well change their lives. I think there is room for that. I think it's happening. And I also think that there are false gods, if you like. A common theme in most religions. There's a saying in Greece, it may go beyond that when the God builds a church, the devil builds one right next door. And I think that there are things that offer to people certainty and a vision which means that they are right, gives them none of the nourishment that a real religion would give them, but offers them some comfort in feeling they've got a reason for living. I'm going to push this particular point of view, which I've never really examined. I can't see the argument one way or another, but at least it makes me feel I belong somewhere. And so, maybe that's good because at least it opens up something. And maybe in fullness of time, they will see that they need something far richer beyond what it is that they're now conceiving as what gives their life value, direction, and purpose. But I do think that we're getting there little by little, and that's the way life has to be led.
Well, I think you're making a huge contribution in helping people to at least understand this idea of attending to those things that we label in the right hemisphere of our attention. And I know your work, has been hugely influential on me in the last few years as well, Iain. So thank you so much for being our guest today on Re-Enchanting. You've certainly helped to re-enchant the sense of the world, mystery, the wonder, the imagination, the divine that we're often missing, but is often there in plain sight if we had the time and ability to look for it.
Thank you very much, both of you, and it's been a huge pleasure and an honour. Thank you.
Thank you for being our guest, and all that remains is to say do join us again for our next episode of Re-Enchanting. Belle and I will be back. There are, of course, ways you can engage with all of the ideas here. Do check out Iain's books, The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things. And we will, of course, link to Iain's website from today's show. But for now, we'll say thank you so much and goodbye, Iain.